The man bought buns, he knows the crack. Vogelsang Ireland in the house. Boys are talking shite. We're getting ready to film. We're getting set up.
Right, okay, so technically we call them a distributor head. More locally, I suppose, in Ireland they'd be referred to, or more commonly known as, a macerator unit. I suppose the key function of them is to evenly distribute out the slurry through the outlets, and then as an added benefit, alright, you do have the slurry is chopped as it exits between the rotating blade up against your fixed cutting screen, and that's what gives you your shear cutting action. So this particular one that I have in front of me would be the ExaCut ECL distributor head. So that would be the #1 distributor in the market, both globally and locally here in Ireland. So we'd have over 40,000 of these units manufactured and sold and operational across the globe to date. So this one in front of me here would be an ECL 3040 unit. So when I say 30, I mean there's 30 outlets, 15 on this side, 15 on the opposite side, and then the 40 just refers to the size of the hose pipes that connect up to the machine itself. So I suppose this would be relatively typical to your 7.5 meter boom. So whether it's a 7.5 meter dribble bar or a 7.5 meter trailing shoe, this would be centrally located within the boom at the heart of the machine itself. Pretty much, I suppose, if you want to call it the engine of the operation itself. So now I'm just going to give the machine just a quick strip down, show you what's involved in changing out the wear parts. So just to clarify before we start, your main wear components within the machine would be, you have 2 blades, one on either side, and then you have 2 cutting rings, one on either side, which are bolted on to the side housings. So now I'm just going to start here first and remove off the in plate. So what you have is you have 5 nuts. They're 16mm, so just the 16mm socket on the ratchet here, and I'll start by loosening them off. Okay, so obviously usually you'd have this, I would say, on your dribble bar or your trailing shoe while you're servicing it. So typically what you can do is you can just actually lift off the in plate and just leave it to one side, and then I suppose your hose pipes that are connected to the outlets on the machine should be enough just to support the dead weight of that. So that's basically what you'll be doing. Then on the inside here, this is what's called your cutting ring. So that's what your blade here, which sits into a rotor, that's driven by a hydraulic motor, and that rotates up against your cutting ring to give you your cutting action. So your slurry is evenly distributed out through each one of the outlets, and then your blade comes along and you have that shear cutting between the blade and the cutting screen to chop the fibres within the slurry itself. So I'm just going to leave this to one side there. Just before I do, it's also important just to note this is your air breather pipe. So on this particular machine, the ECL 3040, you have one air breather on either side of the machine. So this actually lets the air into this air channel here behind the blade. So if you can imagine, your slurry on this particular one comes in through the side inlet, completely floods that chamber full of slurry, and then as your slurry passes out, as I said, it's chopped and evenly distributed out, and then your air comes in on this separate channel or separate chamber to where your slurry is. So as you can imagine, once that rotor is rotating, some of these outlets are getting air while some of them are getting slurry. So effectively what that creates is like a batch effect. So you have a batch of slurry followed by a batch of air, batch of slurry. So it's not quite coming out continuously. There will be a continuous flow of slurry once it's gravity fed down through the hose network itself, but when it comes out of the machine, it's coming out in little batches. So slurry, air, slurry, air. So it is crucially important to get enough air in there, and just to make sure that, I suppose, throughout the life of the machine, that you keep the air breather ways clear and clean at all times. Okay, so now I've that out of the way, I'm just going to remove the center bolt that holds the rotor in place. That's basically what connects it up to your hydraulic motor drive. It sits on a little keyway as well, so you'll see that once I have this ripped out. So it's a size 13. Okay, so that's your center bolt. Just have a washer and then you have a little gasket on it as well. So I'll just leave that to one side. Now before you go any further, what I recommend is just if you get a lint of little lint of M8 thread or rod, which would be the same type of thread as what the center bolt is, and just before you remove the rotor, if you just thread it in, and then that'll basically hold the shims in place when I pull it out. So you have a number of shims in there, and effectively what they do is they act as spacers, so they make sure that your rotor is sitting dead center within the unit to give you even cutting on the left and even cutting on the right hand side. So now I've that just threaded in there. I'm just going to pull out the rotor itself. Okay. So now here we have the rotor. So these are your blades. It's just like a mirror image. If you want to dissect it down the middle of the rotor, you have a blade on either side, and then you have a cutting ring on either side, and on the side then I'm just after removing on the in plate itself. Then what you have inside the machine, on this particular one, as it's a 30 outlet, you have two of these stainless steel units, what we call centrifugal adjusters. I suppose a lot of guys would call them just spring-loaded cams, if you want to call them that, but the beauty about these guys is effectively what they do is they ensure that you have a constant cutting pressure between your blade and cutting screen throughout the wear life. So as your blades and your cutting rings are getting thinner, your cam is always travelling out to ensure you have that constant cutting pressure, as opposed to just having a regular type spring that once it's compressed you'll have more pressure, and then as the spring then springs out you'll have less pressure between your cutting surfaces. So it's a handy little feature on the Vogelsang machines. So one on the top 12 o'clock, one at the bottom at 6 o'clock on this particular machine. So now I'm just going to remove off the blades. So they're effectively just sitting in on top of these blade holders. So it pops off like that. So I suppose the important thing to know about this guy, it's a two-sided self-sharpening blade. You'll see your clearance angle there for giving you your cutting action. So what we'd recommend is that 50% of the time you have the machine rotating in one direction, and then the other 50% you have it rotating in the opposite direction, counterclockwise. And what that does is it ensures that you have your blade sharpened on both sides of the machine, and that will just maximize your wear life of the wear parts within the machine itself. So that's your blade swapped off. So typically, obviously, you'd be replacing both blades. Just for the purpose of the demo, I'll just show you how to remove it and just to pop it back on. Just when you're putting it back, make sure you have the angle the right way around, as if you can see it there in the camera, like so. And that'll just sit tight and snug into the blade holder. You shouldn't need to get a hammer or anything to it. It should just fit in nice and snug by hand. So that's what you're looking at there. Now, once you remove the in plate off the machine, you've fully unwound the pressure on the spring-loaded cams. So I'm going to take out the adjuster just by removing these two stainless steel bolts, and I'm going to wind that back just in a workshop vise with the R clips that come attached to the side of the unit when you buy your new dribble bar or shoe. So I'll just whip that out there now. So that's just a close-up look of it. So you have your two legs on either side of the housing itself, and you can see there's quite a lot of tension on them springs. So now I'm just going to rotate the camera around there, and we're just going to go over to the vise. Okay, so on your Vogelsang ExaCut distributor head, when you get it new, you will have 4 of these cotter or R clips. Well, it'll be 4 on a 30 outlet machine. On some of the bigger machines that have 8, because you have 4 of these centrifugal adjusters in it, but they'll usually be cable tied just onto the side of the housing of the machine. So that's what they're for. So now what I'm going to do is just, this is the easiest way I found anyway, is just to pop in the R clip through one of the sides of the housing, and I'm going to just do the first bit by hand. So what you need to do is make sure that the two legs are sitting over the housing on either side. Just going to wind the first bit back by hand. So bring it along there, and I'm just going to slide in the R-clip so that the end of it is just resting on the leg like so. And then just using a regular old pump pliers. Just going to, it takes the shape of the cam quite well. Just going to rotate it around until the holes. Get a bit of angle on it there now, until the holes line up. Like so. And that's your adjuster wound back. Just repeat the same thing for the other one. Again, just do the first bit by hand. Bring it around, let the end of the clip rest on the leg, like so. Bring it around the cam until the hole lines up. There we go. And that's your eccentric adjuster wound back. Yeah, so just after winding back or repressurizing the springs and the eccentric adjuster, so you have your two R clips in. You'd obviously repeat this for the other eccentric adjuster there on the bottom, which I'm just after doing as well. And I'm just going to sit it back into the housings like so. Now I suppose just a little tip that you learn the hard way sometimes is when you're winding back the adjusters, make sure that you have the R clip face this way around, that you don't have it done to the opposite side, because then you're going to block your threaded holes for screwing in your bolts again.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So see how it slots into the notch. Something that you can do easily enough sometimes if you're rushing or racing, but just a little tip on it. Okay, so now your rotor is ready to go back into the machine. Just before I do that, I'm just going to show you how to replace out the cutting ring on the in plate that I'm after removing there. So I'll just slot this to one side. Here we have the in plate. So just on the side view of the machine, you have 5 brass studs here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm just going to whip them off there with a 15mm socket, just to show you what's involved in that. Now they're off. There. And that's your cutting ring. So I suppose it's very important just to give you the heads up that when you're replacing your wear parts, you should be replacing the 2 of these cutting rings, one on the in plate and one on the inside here, as well as your 2 blades on the rotor itself. So one here and one here, because one, it's a self-sharpening, self-tensioning setup. So if you only just change, I suppose, the blade and you leave your old cutting ring in there, it's not going to self-sharpen up against it. You're going to blunt it out fairly quickly. So it's just to ensure your maximum wear life of your wear components on there. So you'd obviously repeat it for the opposite side of the unit, exactly the same process. So yeah, that's what you're looking at. I'll just quickly pop that on again to the end housing. Okay, so now you have your machine serviced. We're just going to pop back in the rotor in place. Okay, so just to make sure when you're lining up the rotor back onto the keyway that you have the slot for the keyway in the right position. So on my particular setup here, the keyway is at around this position. So I'm just going to flip it around and just make sure it lines up before we slot it back in. Now I'm just going to line it up with the threaded pair. There we go. Just remove out the threaded bar. Pop back in your center bolt. Back on with the 13mm socket. So just to note again, once you remove the in plate, you have to wind back the springs on the eccentric adjusters. Otherwise your blades and that will be pushed out too far. they'll be protruding out over the edge of the housing, and you won't physically be able to get back on your in plate to bolt it into position. So now that's in place, I'm going to pop on the in housing again, like so. Pop back on the 5 bolts, pop back on the 16mm socket, and just tighten it up. Okay, so now with that done, we're just going to go around the side and through the service hatches we're going to pull out the R-clips. So you'll see here, just inside the service hatch, you have your 2 R-clips. So this is just on the bottom eccentric adjuster. I'm going to pull them out, and you'll hear a little bit of a bang there. And what that's doing is it's retensioning the blade up against the cutting screen. So that's 2 out. And then there's another 2 just up at the top here, which you won't see, but you'll just hear. You can hear clicking. Again, just slapping the blade up against the cutting screen, and that has everything retensioned. And pop back on your service hatch covers, and you're ready to go again. So that's the service on the ExaCut ECL complete. Now we're going to move on to the ExaCut ECQ, which is a little bit more straightforward and quicker to service.
Literally put the bar down into the hole like, and jammed it. Like,
yeah, no, I've done it myself as well. Just, yeah,
click back the other way.
just out of curiosity to look at it.
Oh yes, sorry, got that time with the daughter busting that.
Okay, yeah, so this would be the ExaCut ECQ distributor, which would be the one we unveiled in Agriality back in 2019. So I suppose, just looking into the machine, I suppose the first thing you'll know is that the housing is that bit bigger. So we've actually widened the maintenance hatch to now give you quicker and easier access into the machine itself. We've reconfigured the internals, so now that you can do all the service through the front of the machine here, you no longer have to remove the in plate like you do on the ECL and the majority of the machines in the marketplace. So it just makes, I suppose, yeah, your servicing a hell of a lot easier, far less downtime in the field. Then in terms of, I suppose, the cutting action, you now have a 3-sided blade, so it's triangular shaped blade. So if you can imagine, for every rotation you're getting an extra cut, so that therefore reduces your hydraulic power requirement. So you could, as opposed to on the ECL, you could be operating at maybe 50 litres a minute hydraulic flow. You could operate this one at say 30-35 litres a minute hydraulic flow. So, and you know, now as your systems, your tankers are getting bigger, your hydraulic power requirements is becoming a much bigger consideration, a much bigger player when choosing a distributor head. So now what I'm going to do is just start, again like I did on the ExaCut ECL earlier, I'm just going to start stripping down the machine, breaking it down, showing you what's involved in changing out the wear parts, so the blades and the cutting rings, and then just rebuilding it all back together again, essentially. So now what I'm going to start here is, first thing you'll notice as well inside the machine is that on this particular one it's 30 outlet, same as the ECL over there. So you've actually 3 of these eccentric adjusters on it. So that will give you a bit more cutting pressure as well between your blade and your cutting screen, as opposed to having 2. So you have more springs there if you like. Now you no longer have to remove this adjuster and would say put it into the vise to rewind the springs on it. You can actually do all of that in situ. So just with a size 5 Allen key, you can wind back, take the pressure off. So you heard that little spring there, there's a latch mechanism there. So now I've taken the pressure off the blade and the screen, and if I just press the latch, undo the latch, now you have the cam has pushed the blade back up against your cutting ring. So for the purpose of servicing the machine and breaking it down, I'm going to release the pressure on all of the cams on the 3 eccentric adjusters. So as I said, it can all be done through the service hatch, nice, quick and easy. Okay, and now I'm just going to remove the center bolt. So again, a 13mm spanner. Okay, so that's your center bolt and washer, and then you just have a cover here, plastic cover, and a little gasket which sits in over the 3 bolts and just keeps the slurry out from them effectively. Now on the left hand side here you'll see you have a collar. and that's held in place with 3 bolts and 3 washers. So effectively what that's doing is it's just supporting the dead weight of the rotor on this side of the machine. So I'm just going to loosen the 3 of them off now, and that's done with a size 6 hex or a 6 Allen key if you want. So that one's just loosened there. Okay, now just moving over to the opposite side here, just to remove out the splined rotor adapter. There is 3 bolts holding that in as well also, and that'll be an 8mm hex fitting. So just going to loosen them there, and just slot out the rotor adapter. So that's your spline connection onto your hydraulic motor drive. That's where your 3 bolts screw in, and then you also have your 3 other holes here which will actually act as a puller tool. So for whatever reason, if your rotor adapter is stuck in place, you can actually screw in your 3 bolts and it'll act as a puller tool, and it'll just prise it out gently. So it's a nice little kind of service tip just if you're in bother removing it out. Now with the rotor adapter out of place, I'm just going to remove the collar on the left hand side. Okay, and now I'm just going to slide it out. Nice and easy. So all done, as I said, through the surface hatch, making it nice and quick and easy just to access. Now this is your new 3-sided blade I was on about earlier. Just pops off like that. So it's actually a thicker blade as well. It's 15mm as opposed to around 11mm on the ECL. So you're extending your wear life as well on this machine by up to 50% longer. So that's your blade. And now also what you'll notice is just on this side of the machine, just going to pop off your cutting ring. So this is actually engrooved into the housing of the machine, so you no longer have to undo the 5 studs or bolts from the outside of the machine. So again, that's saving you another couple of minutes on either side of the machine. So that's actually your cutting surface there, your blade just rotating up against your cutting ring to give you a nice smooth cutting action. So as previous, you'll be replacing your 2 blades, one on either side, here and here, replacing your 2 cutting rings, one on this side and one on that side. So now you have your machine serviced. We're just going to rebuild it back as we got it. Okay, so we're going to pop back in the cutting ring. Just make sure that the outlets line up with the holes on the cutting rings, or the openings. So there's just a little paper gasket as well that sits in behind it and just beds it up to the housing itself. I'm going to pop back on the blade. Just sits nice and snug in. Just make sure you put it the right way around with your clearance angle like so, because that's what's going to be cutting or making it your cutting surface up against your cutting ring. So now I'm just going to slot it back in. Okay, so that's your center collar back in place. I'm just going to pop in your rotor adapter now. Now just a little tip I've learned is that just before you slot in your rotor adapter onto the spline shaft itself, just screw in one of the bolts, and it makes it easier just to line up when it's back in position. So I'm just going to work my way around here, just find one of the threaded holes and just screw it in a couple of mil. And now at that point I'm just going to lift up the rotor and line it in, because once you put it on the spline fitting itself, you want your holes to be all lined up for your 3 bolts to secure it back into position. Okay, now we're just going to tighten them up. Okay, so that's your rotor adapter back in, 3 bolts tightened up. Just on the opposite side now. Just going to make sure our collar lines up with the hole, just going to put in the bolt then and just the washer, and that just secures it then into position. So finally tighten the last one. Okay, so now that we've that done, I'm just going to release the latch mechanism to retension the blades on either side back up against the cutting ring. So you'll hear the latch undoing itself there. I'm just going to do it then, repeat that for the other two. So as you see, there is good pressure between them, to be fair. And that's your ExaCut ECQ serviced.
Preventative maintenance. Never heard of it, Paul. Explain.
That hasn't.
I don't know many lads that believe in it now, but come on.
Yeah, I suppose, look, they're straightforward enough machine, but there is just a couple of things just to keep on top of, I suppose. So the first thing that I would say is that it's important on both machines just to have the rotor rotating, we'll say roughly half the time in one direction, and then the other 50% of the time rotating on the opposite direction, just to make sure that you're sharpening both sides of your blades, just to, I suppose, maximize your wear life or wear life period, if you want to call it that. So I suppose the next thing then just to keep an eye on is that typically when these are mounted into at the center of your dribble bar or trailing shoe, you're going to have a piece of lay flat just underneath the 6-inch flange on the bottom. It'll be similar as well on the ECL, and that's where, we'll say, when your slurry comes in through the machine, in through the side, it completely floods up the chamber. Then any heavier objects should just gravity feed down into your stone trap, if you want to call it that. So it's important just to make sure you empty that every so often. Just keep an eye on it, because you don't want your stones or anything like that just to back up and come in contact with your wear parts. So just keep an eye on that, I suppose. Then if you're parking it up for prolonged periods, so we'll say once the slurry ban comes in or that, what I recommend, and it's good practice to do in general, is to wash them out every so often. And as I said, if you're parking up for prolonged periods, just to put a bit of lubricant in, even just a bit of dirty diesel or anything like that, after you wash it out, just put it in between your cutting rings and your blades. Just give the unit a couple of spins. Don't try to run it for too long, just give it a bit of a couple of spins. Now make sure while you're working on the machines as well, and you have the service hatch covers off, that you have the keys of the tractor in your pocket, that there's no fear that the hydraulics can be activated, just from a safety point of view. I suppose, yeah, so one of the two more points I'd like to discuss, and so one would be, you'll see on the side of the machine there, you've a grease nipple. I suppose the official line is to give it a shot of grease every 50 hours of operation, and what that effectively does is you have your two seals between your hydraulic motor drive and your slurry chamber, and that just forms a packing between the two seals. So it's important to keep that topped up. Again, it'll be the same on the ECL as well. And then finally is just on your air breathers. From time to time you get guys ringing you up and saying that their hose pipes are oscillating or vibrating like mad, and that's usually a telltale sign that your air breathers are blocked up. So over time, so I suppose if you're looking at a typical dribble bar or trailing shoe, if it's say a 30 outlet like what these units are on a 7.5 metre, you'll have one air breather on either side of the boom. So you'll see a hose pipe that doesn't go all the way to the ground, or if it's a trailing shoe, it won't have a shoe on the end of it obviously, and that's what's effectively getting your air into the system. So if you can imagine, as your rotor's rotating, it'll be creating a bit of a vacuum to suck the air into the machine. So your air is critically important to get the correct flow out of your distributor head. So they can suck up dirt and cake up over time. So good practice is just to make sure that the air breather pipes are just washed out periodically, and that you've basically just to avoid any blockages on the air breathers themselves. So that's quite important, to be fair. That would be it, I suppose, from a preventative maintenance point of view. Just as I said, I should have mentioned it to you earlier as well, just on the ExaCut ECL, if you follow me around, there is just a little wear indicator. So just when you're looking in through the service hatch, you'll see you have your washer here, just there on the left hand side, and it's on the right. So that's a little wear indicator. So if this washer is touching off this housing here on the left, that means that your spring-loaded cam has come to the end of its travel, and you're no longer going to have pressure between your blade and your cutting screen. Your machine is going to repeatedly block up because there's no pressure between the surfaces, and then at that point, that's when you need to change out your wear parts. cutting rings and blades. So yeah, that'll be pretty much it in terms of the preventative maintenance side of things.
We're all about the Vogelsang merch now. The gain feeds hat can go in the bin. Just for the end of the video there, Paul, what other stuff does Vogelsang do then? Macerators?
Yeah, so we do your inlet macerator. So I suppose if you're handling real heavy types of slurry and you want to chop it down before it enters the tank, you would go with the likes of our ExaCut inlet macerator. Then we do complete dribble bars, trailing shoes, rotary lobe pumps, that type of thing. And then we'd also do a rotary lobe pump that'd be PTO driven on a 3-point linkage. So we'd say just as a basic slurry type transfer pump. So you'll be able to check that all out on our website, and if you follow us there on our Facebook page, Vogelsang Ireland, and you'll also see it on our YouTube page as well, Vogelsang Ireland. So if you go on there, you'll see a lot of our agricultural applications and products. Thanks.
Lovely job. He had that one well rehearsed. He got the Facebook page, website, the whole lot in there.